The liver is a large organ in the abdomen, and one of the fun facts that people often know about it is that it has a really good regenerative capacity. That means it is able to heal, to repair, to grow new bits of liver. But the caveat to that is it can only repair kind of so many times. So if the liver is injured and it repairs and it's injured and it's repaired and it's injured and it's repaired, it often changes and the liver can become more fibrous, and that limits the amount of blood that can pass through the liver. Why is that a problem? Well, we're going to talk about the anatomy of portosystemic anastomoses and portocaval anastomoses. They're the same thing, two different words, which will explain what's going on and why it's a problem. The liver is part of the gastrointestinal system. Let's get one of those. So the job of the gastrointestinal tract is to absorb nutrients, right? We pass food in, it goes down the esophagus and runs into the stomach and around the bowel here, and everything gets digested. Where does all of that go to? So here's the liver. The heart would be sitting here with the diaphragm in the way. The stomach, the small intestine, there goes the spleen. All of the blood from the gastrointestinal tract will be passed to the liver, and the liver will process much of it. It'll pass through the liver, and the liver is wrapped around the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava will run up to the heart, and the superior vena cava will run down to the heart. They're both running to the right atrium. This is taking blood from the thorax, head, neck, upper limbs. This is taking blood from the abdomen, lower limbs, and what have you, right? If you want to consider this as one organ, this tube, it is a huge organ. So it has a really rich blood supply. Here's the aorta, it gives off three branches, the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery, which give off branches to parts of the gastrointestinal tract we refer to as the foregut, the midgut, and then the hindgut. And the venous drainage of this organ is organised similarly in that there is a inferior mesenteric vein, superior mesenteric vein, and actually a splenic vein. So the spleen is out here. There it is. And those three come together in some configuration to form what gets called the hepatic portal vein. And the hepatic portal vein goes to the liver. It's called a portal vein because it's not your typical vein that's just coming from an organ and going back to the heart. No, it's a portal vein between one organ and another organ, the liver. So the gastrointestinal tract absorbs nutrients, passes those nutrients into the blood. That blood is passed to the liver does things with it, and then that blood is passed into the inferior vena cava and it gets back to the heart and what we call the systemic circulation. So we have the systemic circulation of the body as a whole, and then we kind of have that portal bit, that hepatic portal bit, which is just a bit of the circulation between the gastrointestinal tract and the liver. Seems like a pretty good setup if it works. However, there's a lot of blood passing from the GI tract through the liver to the inferior vena cava. There's a lot of blood goes through to the GI tract, comes out of the GI tract. If the liver was to become fibrous, my esophagus has fallen out. If it was to become fibrous, more connective tissue in there than channels allowing blood to pass through it, then the blood that's passing to the liver finds it harder to pass through the liver to get to the inferior vena cava. And it's a huge volume of blood, which means that the blood will take alternate routes if it's easier to do so. And in the body we find venous anastomoses, So veins are a little bit more, veins are more likely to be more variable than arteries. In a number of places in the body, we find veins linking. That would be an anastomosis. So an anastomosis is a link between two tubes. There's a connection between two tubes, and it's commonly used when we talk about arteries and veins. This would be a venous anastomosis. Two veins doing different jobs, but they're linked because veins often are. These are the portosystemic anastomoses. Blood would normally be passing through the liver, but now it's finding it harder to pass through the liver, so it is going to find other easier routes to pass through. That might mean that the blood is now passing in a different direction to normal. Alright, what are the portosystemic anastomoses? I can better describe them one by one and you'll get a sense of this. There are 5, there are kind of 3 important ones and 2, three, you'll see. Okay, number 1, the most common one, the one that causes the most problems, I think. The esophagus runs to the stomach here. Now, it was passing through the diaphragm. The diaphragm is separating the thorax from the abdomen. Now, in this last part of the esophagus, the distal esophagus or the lower esophagus, the blood from the esophagus here can drain in 2 different directions. The blood could pass this way, inferiorly, with the left gastric vein, which is going to drain to the portal vein back here, and then on to the liver up here, right? So the blood of the lower esophagus could pass to the left gastric vein, hepatic portal vein to the liver, through the liver to the inferior vena cava, and then back to the heart. But the esophagus is also in the thorax. In the thorax, we have veins in the posterior wall here. I'll grab another model which shows this a little bit more nicely. Look, here's the heart. I've taken the lungs out, we'll spin it around. There's the diaphragm, there's the esophagus, there's the aorta. These are the hemiazygos veins. This is the azygos system. So the lower esophagus can also drain its blood into the azygos system. So hemiazygos and azygos veins, they'll pass over to this side, and then there's the azygos vein there. It does this beautiful thing where it ascends and it loops over. This is the hilum of the lung here, this is the airway. It loops over here and it drains into the superior vena cava. So the blood from the lower esophagus can pass to the superior vena cava and back to the heart, or it could pass to the inferior vena cava and back to the heart. Now, what if those esophageal veins were linked? Well, if the veins of the lower esophagus were linked, then if blood was finding it difficult to pass through the liver, it could instead go the wrong way and go through the left gastric vein to those lower esophageal veins, through those anastomoses to the other lower esophageal veins, into the azygos system, and then back up here and return to the superior vena cava. And that's what happens. That's the first portosystemic anastomosis in the lower esophagus, and it is an easier route for blood to follow if it can't pass through the liver. So that's number 1, lower esophagus. Number 2, the pelvis. This is a female pelvis, but it doesn't matter. Take this one apart, and we are here in the anal canal. So this is the last part of the gastrointestinal tract. So the rectum has passed to here, then we have the anal canal. And the venous drainage of the upper part of the anal canal is through the inferior mesenteric vein, to the hepatic portal vein, to the liver, through the liver, into the inferior vena cava, and back to the heart. But the inferior part of the anal canal, which is closer to the skin, doesn't drain blood like the gut does, it drains blood like the skin does. The middle and inferior rectal veins will drain to the internal pudendal vein, which is the vein of this region, which will drain back to the internal iliac vein inside the pelvis, which will go to the common iliac vein, and then the inferior vena cava in that way. So what would happen if the superior rectal veins and the middle and inferior rectal veins were linked by anastomoses? Well, they are. And that means that if the liver, way up there, is fibrosed and blood is finding it really difficult to pass through the liver, the blood might find it easier to pass the wrong way down the inferior mesenteric vein to the superior rectal veins, across those anastomoses to the middle and inferior rectal veins, into the internal pudendal vein, to the internal iliac vein, common iliac vein, inferior vena cava, and then back to the heart. So the blood can get back to the heart bypassing the liver, but it has to flow the wrong way. So that's the second portosystemic anastomosis in the anal canal. Number 3. This is a good one. Number 3, here's the umbilicus, the belly button. Now the skin around here normally drains through a number of epigastric veins. Think about the belly, right? Gaster rather than the stomach, nice belly shape. So the vein, they get called epigastric because they're upon the belly. But the skin around the umbilicus drains through epigastric veins. They're pretty superficial because we're talking about the skin. So they might drain down to the long saphenous vein. They'll drain to the external iliac vein in there, to the common iliac vein, and then inferior vena cava, back to the heart, and off that blood goes around the body again, right? But when you were a fetus, you were attached to your mum's blood supply at your umbilicus. So there used to be an umbilical vein here, and that umbilical vein ran from here, kind of up here, to the liver and the inferior vena cava. So that was, at the time, nice oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich blood going to the inferior vena cava, to the heart, and whoosh around the body. When you were born, your umbilical vein closed up, and in the adult it becomes the ligamentum teres, or the round ligament, which you'd find here, you'd find where it was in the fetus, right? But it had some little veins running with it called para-umbilical veins. Those para-umbilical veins are likely to still be doing something, but probably not very much normally. But those para-umbilical veins will link the umbilicus with the liver and the portal system and the inferior vena cava. So if the liver has become fibrosed and blood is finding it difficult to pass through the liver to get to the inferior vena cava, it might instead pass down those para-umbilical veins to the umbilicus and the skin around here, where those para-umbilical veins anastomose with the epigastric veins here. So that blood will then pass into the epigastric veins into the, say, external iliac vein, common iliac vein, inferior vena cava, and get back to the heart that way. Now, you're most likely to detect this occurring by ultrasound, finding that there's more venous flow through those veins than you would expect by looking with ultrasound. In rare and very advanced cases, this leads to something called caput medusae, Medusa's head. Medusa was the gorgon with the snakes in the hair that with a look would turn you to stone, right, from Greek mythology. So, and we'll talk more about this when we get back to the clinical bit at the end, but veins are not very good at taking more blood than they're used to. They're not as strong as arteries. They will stretch and distend. So in the skin around the umbilicus, caput medusae are veins that have become larger than they normally would be. So you get what looks like a ring of snakes around the umbilicus. That's number 3, the umbilical portosystemic anastomosis. Those are the big 3 that we've covered. There are 2 more. They're not little ones, they're just kind of harder to point at, and these have been pretty hard to point at. Number 4 would be retroperitoneal. That means I'm going to have to take everything out. Retroperitoneal. The abdominal cavity is lined by peritoneum, a thin serous membrane, a thin sheet, a thin connective tissue that makes a little bit of fluid. All of this, and in fact some of this, which I can't separate on this model, so like the duodenum and the ascending colon and descending colon, essentially are tied to the posterior abdominal wall by peritoneum covering them, right? So retroperitoneally, so posterior to the peritoneum, we have the inferior vena cava draining blood to the heart, and we have things like these renal vessels. We have, for example, colic veins draining the bowel, so they're draining back to the liver, and they can anastomose with other retroperitoneal veins that are back here draining various other structures. We also have the splenic vein, so here's the duodenum and the pancreas, those are retroperitoneal. The splenic vein is draining structures back to the portal vein and the liver. And we have renal veins draining structures of the posterior abdominal wall back to the inferior vena cava. To put it more concisely, there are a number of anastomoses retroperitoneally, so between retroperitoneal structures that drain to the liver, like the spleen, the pancreas, the duodenum, ascending colon, descending colon, and structures that drain to the inferior vena cava that are also retroperitoneal, like the kidneys, the gonads, the adrenal glands and that sort of thing. So that is number 4. These are retroperitoneal portosystemic anastomoses. And portal hypertension. So if blood can't pass through the liver because the liver has become fibrous and it's hard for all of that blood from the gastrointestinal tract to get through the liver to the inferior vena cava, it could instead pass the wrong way or a different way and pass through retroperitoneal portosystemic anastomoses to get to the inferior vena cava and back to the heart and go off around the body. Now, this is the most common cause of ascites. So this is all, peritoneum's a story for another day, but I said that peritoneum lines the abdominal cavity, things that are posterior to it are retroperitoneal. All of this stuff is covered by peritoneum and becomes mesenteries and what have you. The peritoneal cavity is the potential space that's left in here. There's a little bit of fluid in there, which is great because it means that everything can move around nice and freely and easily. It's like a bit of a lubrication, right? But with portal hypertension, that is, it's difficult for blood to pass through the liver, and blood then takes those alternate routes through those retroperitoneal anastomoses, that leads to more peritoneal fluid being made, more peritoneal fluid collecting in the peritoneal cavity. That is ascites. And I think portal hypertension is the most common cause of ascites. And as that fluid builds up in the peritoneal cavity, it will cause the abdomen to distend. So that's number 4, retroperitoneal portosystemic anastomoses. One more to go, and I'm just going to point at the liver for that one. In the liver itself, there are anastomoses between the liver that's draining to the inferior vena cava and bits of the liver that are draining to that azygos system again. So these are intrahepatic portosystemic anastomoses. So blood that's struggling to pass through the liver in the normal way to get to the inferior vena cava might instead pass through those intrahepatic portosystemic anastomoses into the azygos system and up to the superior vena cava up there, back to the heart and off around the body. And those are the 5 portosystemic anastomoses that we talk about in anatomy textbooks. Let's go right back to the first one, the most common one, because it's quite dangerous. Okay, so the esophageal portosystemic anastomosis in the lower esophagus. These veins down here, like veins elsewhere in the body, as I said, they're not as strong as arteries. Arteries have thick muscular walls, they are carrying high pressure blood. They're used to that, that's their day job. Veins carry low pressure blood after it's passed through a capillary bed back to the heart. So they've got smooth muscle in their layers, but not as much. They are thin-walled, they are mostly connective tissue. So when more blood has to pass through those lower esophageal veins than normal, over time, those esophageal veins will start to dilate and start to distend. And these are varices. So these would be lower esophageal varices. And these are commonly caused by an addiction to alcohol. They're dangerous because eventually, if they keep distending, they're going to burst. And if they burst, that will lead to, well, bleeding and shock and potentially death. So when those lower esophageal varices burst, that's difficult to deal with. So the main treatments are focused on preventing those varices from getting that bad in the first place. So it's prevention rather than cure, but it's dangerous. So lower esophageal varices, the first portosystemic anastomosis we talked about, is the most common, probably the most dangerous. But there you go. That explains the flow of blood through the liver, the portal system, and it explains that there are 5 regions that we generally refer to when we talk about links between the portal system and the caval system, those inferior and superior vena cava draining blood back to the heart. And hopefully you have a better understanding now. You need quite a bit of anatomy knowledge to keep up with this, I know, but hopefully you have a better understanding of how those anastomoses can take more blood through a different route in a different direction if the liver becomes fibrosed through disease. All right. It's a difficult one to point out because models don't have as many veins as I would like, but there you go. Portosystemic anastomosis. See you next week.